Hi, in this video we will be learning the basics of Unreal Engine by creating an environment inside it for your first home task titled Your Future Home. First off, we will be creating a new project. Unreal Engine is constantly evolving and so is its toolset, including how you create your project. In the hopes of making this video more useful in the future as well, let's go through its project creation workflow. So let's go ahead and launch the engine. Chances are this interface will go through a bunch of changes, but the logic behind them should largely stay the same. We want to create a new project. We will be using the game preset. Unreal Engine is a very versatile tool that can also be used in different industries. And to make its use easier in those industries, there are different presets that you can use if you want to go down that route. There are multiple templates that you can use that provide basic functionality for many different types of gameplay. If you want to know more about these templates, read their description here. Then there are various settings that we can change to make the engine behave in a way that suits our project the best. The most important setting for us in this case is whether the project will be using Blueprint or C++ base classes from the previous template that we chose. In this course, we will be sticking with Blueprint only. Then there are scaling parameters that you can change to help your project scale on various platforms. And you can include or omit the starter content. That is a collection of assets, mainly meshes and materials that you can use to kickstart your project. Having this option enabled greatly increases the size of your project. So in general, I might omit this, but in this case, they will be very useful for detailing the house we are going to be creating. So let's leave this enabled. Then you can choose the location of your project and name it. In this case, we will be naming it My Future Home. To make it easier for the person that's grading your homework, you might want to also add in your name here. And once that's done, let the engine create the project files for you. As this engine version is still in preview, we will be using the old engine version to create the project instead. So let's go back to the launcher, and I will be launching the last available release version of the engine at the time of this recording. The available options themselves are pretty similar, but organized in a different way. So again, we will be creating a Blueprint project. We will be using the third-person template. We will be adding the starter content. The project location is fine for my use, and I'll be naming this My Future Home. Now create the project. The first time you launch the engine, it might take a while for the engine to compile the shaders, upwards of 10 minutes in some cases. If you are indeed worrying that the engine has frozen, just launch the task manager and check what is going on in there. Now let's give you a general overview of what you can see once the project has loaded. In the middle here, we have the viewport that displays the game world. This can be in perspective view as well as orthographic views and different modes of shading. Let's go back to the perspective view. On the left here, we have the modes panel. This changes the way that you are interactive with the currently loaded game world. By default, it is in placement mode, but this can be changed by choosing any of the different modes available here. Also, do note the tooltips when hovering over something. For example, you can change the currently active mode by holding down Shift and pressing the 1 to 5 number keys. Keep your eye on this area here if you want to see what are the buttons that I am pressing at any given time. Above the viewport is the toolbar. In here you have quick access to many of the most useful functions. To the top right here is the world outliner. This shows you the content of the currently loaded level or levels. Below that we have the details panel that shows you the detailed properties of the currently selected object. Covering most of the bottom of the editor is the content browser. I also prefer having the tree view open. To do that, click this small button here. I find that this gives you a better overview of the folder structure. This main content folder includes a geometry folder, the mannequin folder that has the assets for this third-person character, the starter content that is here because we chose to create the project with the starter content, and the third-person and the third-person blueprint assets that are here because we created this project from the third-person template. On the very top here, we also have the menu bar that has your basic file input output as well as visible tool options, and this tab bar that currently has our level editor view open. If you happen to close a window, for example, if I close the details here, it is very likely that you can get it back by looking at the window options here. In this case, under the level editor options, let's just click this. You can also rearrange the elements by grabbing this tab section here and docking it to any of these dockable sections. Let's move it back here. And if you want the look to be cleaner, you can also hide this tab. This itself will leave the view open but hide the card section. You can re-enable the card section by clicking this yellow triangle here. The same is true for the viewport, for example. Before moving on to the viewport navigation, let's take a quick look at the documentation. In this case, the Getting Started section and the Level Designer Quick Start. This provides much of the same information that is covered in this video. But in addition, it has most of the keyboard shortcuts that will be used written out. Also, there's probably more shortcuts here that I won't be using but are at least as or even more useful. Now to the viewport basics. Movement is done by holding down right click and using the W, A, S and D keys to move around. You can press Q and E to descend and ascend. And to change the speed at which you move, when holding down the right click, you can scroll down or scroll up to move faster or move slower. If you want to focus on an object, select it by left clicking and press F to zoom your view on it. Now you can also hold down the Alt key and press left click to orbit around the object. Still holding down Alt, right clicking and holding the button down and moving the mouse to zoom in and out. You can also move forward and backward by scrolling up and scrolling down on the mouse wheel. Also note that you can select the objects from the world outliner and focus on them. In this case, I focused on the sky sphere, which is several hundred times larger than any of the other objects in the scene. So to quickly get back to the view I want to have, I can click any of the objects that are at a more reasonable scale and click F in the viewport. To make sure that the viewport is the currently active window, right click it beforehand. Inside the editor here, to deselect an object, press Escape. To select multiple objects, hold down Shift. Note that while holding down Shift, if you re-click on an object, it is not deselected. But if you hold down Control, you can also deselect and add objects to your selection. Again, Escape to deselect everything. Now on to changing the level itself by adding and removing objects from it and changing their properties. When adding a new object to the world, you want to be in the placement mode. Shortcut Shift 1. Objects available for placement are categorized on the left here. In this case, let's select the cube by left clicking on it and dragging it into our scene. Once you have released right click, an instance of this object will be added to your scene. To further modify the transform of this object, we have this gizmo here that is currently in translate mode. Shortcut key W. You can use these arrows to move the object around. If you hold down Shift while moving the object around, your camera will move with it. If you click on the gizmo on this square here, you can move the object around the plane that is defined by the two axes connected to it. Right now, grid snapping is enabled and it has an interval of 10 units. One Unreal Engine length unit is equal to 1 centimeter. You can change the snapping distance from this drop down here. For example, now the snapping distance is 1 meter. Instead of using the translation gizmo, you can also use the details panel. The very first property in the transform section is the location, where you can manually enter values. You can also do the same for rotation and scale. But there are different gizmos that you can use for that as well. You can select them from here or use their keyboard shortcuts. W for translation, E for orientation, and R for scale. If you want to reset any of these values, you can click this Reset to Default option here in the Details panel. Also, you can press End with an object selected to snap it to the closest surface beneath it. Do note that Unreal Engine uses the Z-up convention when it comes to the coordinate system. To create a copy of the object, you can either use the default Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V shortcuts to create a copy of it, or a faster way of doing it inside Unreal is by holding down the Alt key and clicking and dragging in any of the transform modes. Now let's say we wanted to do something a little bit more useful. Let's select the stairs here, create a copy of it by Alt dragging it, rotate it so it faces this wall here, and move it into position. Right now the stairs are too low, so to make it easier for our character to move up and down them, let's press R to go into scale mode and scale the stairs in the Z-axis. Right now the stairs are intersecting with this platform here, but if you try to move it, our grid snapping distance is too high. So we can either lower it or we can disable it altogether. But again, if you want to be more precise, you can use the detail panel values here. Note that the Epic team does everything in their power to make Unreal Engine as stable as possible. It is still very advisable to save the changes that you have made quite frequently. So you can use the Save Current option here, or File Save All, shortcut Ctrl-Shift-S. Having made the changes that we wanted, it is a good idea to playtest the level. You can do so by clicking this play button here. Also note that the shortcut for this is Alt P. So instead of pressing the button, I can use that shortcut instead. Once you're in game mode, the toolbar has changed now, and we have possessed this character. Although when pressing any of the movement buttons, nothing happens because the viewport itself is not active. To make it active, click on any of the mouse buttons inside it. To exit the play in editor mode, press Escape. To delete any of the objects that we have created, select them and press Backspace or Delete. Now on to creating your future home itself. For that, we will be creating a new level. We could create it in the Maps folder inside this third-person blueprint folder. But in this case, I will make a new dedicated Maps folder inside the base content folder. I can do that by right-clicking on the content folder and from the options choosing Create New Folder. Let's name it Maps. Inside this folder, we want to create our new level. There are many ways that you can create new assets, including levels. Again, you can right-click in any of the folders and create a new asset from the options available here. But in the case of creating a new level, you will get a few more options if you go into the File menu and select New Level. Here we have 3 presets, an empty level, a level meant for VR interactions, and the default level. Let's select the default level because this has the sky and the sunlight already set up for us. This should load you into the new level, which is currently untitled. So actually, before making any changes here, let's save it. Because this hasn't been saved before, we can click this Save Current option and it will ask us where we want to save the level. Let's save it in the newly created Maps folder. Let's name it something reasonable. In my case, Map Future House. And enter to save. On to creating this house. We could use the base geometry available inside the editor, like the cubes and other objects. Looking at the top options here, they appear to be very similar, but in fact they are much more flexible in nature. For example, this cylinder brush here. We can choose the amount of edges that make up its outer curvature. In this case, it is 8. We can change it to whatever we want, for example, 3 sides, or 32 sides to make it more rounded instead. You can also change the brush shape to select any of these different brushes that are available in the modes panel here. And you can also make it hollow inside and change the wall thickness. Different brush shapes have different parameters, so selecting any other one, you will see different properties here. So by changing these parameters, we can vastly change the outcome shape of these brushes. The house we are going to be making is going to be very simple, but to make sure that the dimensions themselves work, let's find the third-person blueprint and drag the third-person character into the level. This is useful to see, for example, if the door is high enough so we can actually fit and walk through it. In this case, this door frame is probably too small for the capsule to actually fit through it. Let's get on with actually creating the house. Let's create the box brush. I'll move it the position that I think will work in this case. To decide the base dimensions of the house, it's probably easier to enter them numerically. So let's say that the house is, let's say 4 meters deep and 8 meters wide. Let's move it up a little bit. For this, I will change the snapping distance back to 10 units and move it up a little bit. Now, to actually make this into a house, let's make it hollow from the inside. And let's say that the wall thickness is going to be 25 centimeters. Now, once we move inside to our brush, we can see that there is an actual space inside it. But we have a problem. We don't have an entrance to this house. To fix that, let's create another box brush and move it roughly where we think that we want the entrance to be. Here seems fine enough. There is another option that we didn't touch before. This is the brush type. Brushes can either be additive or subtractive. And by changing this brush to subtractive, it actually cuts out the piece from the brush that makes up the basic walls and ceiling and floor of our house. Do note that the order in which the brushes are placed in is important when placing these additive and subtractive brushes. So if I add in another box here, it will not have a piece cut out of it, even though it is overlapping our subtractive brush. If we wanted the new brush to be affected by the previously placed subtractive brush, we can select that subtractive brush. You can also do it from the world outliner. If you select a certain face from it, you will have extra options for texturing and materials that we'll get to very shortly. But we care about the brush settings themselves. You can show the advanced brush settings by clicking this down arrow here, and we can change the order from here. And let's move it to last. And now you can see that our subtractive brush subtracts from both of these brushes. In this case, this cube here doesn't make much sense, so I'll get rid of it. And the door itself also seems a bit too wide, so let me change its y-axis dimension to something a bit more reasonable. And let's also clean it up on the x-axis as well. You can repeat the same process for the windows as well. Making sure that we're in placement mode, hold down Alt on the translation gizmo and drag it over. The windows themselves aren't probably as high, so let's scale it down on the z-axis a little bit. And maybe we want to have multiple windows in this wall. And again, we can select multiple objects, Alt, Shift drag to move with the objects and the camera, and place them on the other wall. To add a bit more detail to our house, let's add a proper roof to it. To do that, let's duplicate the very same box brush that we used to create the base shape of the house. And again, Alt-click to create a duplicate of it. Let's not make it hollow and unclick this option here. But this really doesn't look like a roof. We could do something like using subtractive brushes to actually carve out the roof shape. We can also use scaling, although this is not really that recommended when using brushes, because it will also scale the materials later on placed on it. We can do something like this and duplicate this and create our roof shape like this. But brushes themselves have extra flexibility built in, so let's try doing something a bit smarter. So let's get rid of these subtractive brushes. Now let's select our roof brush here. Let's go into edit mode, which has a shortcut of Shift and 5. Now you can see that our selected brush turned purplish. What we can do here now is actually select different parts of the brush, for example, the corner vertices, and move them around individually to make greater changes. In this case, let's select top face here and scale it together so that it actually creates this singular edge on the top here. There are some advanced options that you can dig into if you look at the documentation, but we won't be covering them here. If you're done editing your brushes here, you can go back into the placement mode by pressing Shift and 1. Now again, let's save and playtest the level by pressing Alt P and going into the game. We can fit through the door, we have our windows here, and we have our nice little house. You can add a bunch more detail here if you want to. For example, maybe adding an entire attic here that you can use stairs to access. Though it is a good idea to keep your brushwork on some sort of a grid. If you don't, you can end up breaking the brushes, either visually or worse yet, in a way that actually affects gameplay. For example, if I select one of these stairwards here and move it upwards, then you can see that I can now see through my brush here, which is definitely not the intent. So try to avoid that. To add more detail to your actual brushwork, you can use materials. As you probably remembered, we added starter content. And if we navigate into its material folder in the content browser, we can see that there are multiple materials available for our use. In this case, let's say that the walls of the house are made from brick. To apply materials to your object, you can just drag them over top of the surface that you want to apply them to, like this. You can do it individually, or you can do it by selecting multiple surfaces at once. Right now we are selecting surfaces on the same brush, but we're making different surfaces on it active. The same shortcut logic applies. So if we want to select multiple surfaces, we can hold down Control. And you can actually shift left click to apply the currently active material in the content browser. Let's separate our staircase for a second here. Selecting all of these faces individually would be quite tedious. So instead of doing that, let's use the geometry selection options inside the details panel for the currently selected brush. So go into the geometry section. In the select options, select all coplanar surfaces. Now we have selected the entire side of this staircase and we can apply our brick material to it. But once we deselect it, we can now see that things are not really working properly and the material is not properly aligning like it does on the wall here. But this is a fixable problem. Again, let's select one of these faces here. Let's again select all coplanar surfaces. And next to this selection option, we can also align surfaces. In this case, align surface planar will work nicely. And now we have our brick material nicely fixed. In this case, the staircase doesn't make much sense for me, so I will actually be getting rid of it. To add more detail to our house, let's for example add static mesh window frames to our windows. For that, let's move into the props folder and search for the window frame static mesh. Let's drag it into our scene and move it into place. We can see that this doesn't really align up very well with the window dimensions that we have added. We could change it by changing the dimensions of the brushes themselves, or we can scale and move the frame mesh. So let me disable snapping and move this into a better position and scale it by pressing R and making it a bit bigger, moving down a little bit. Let's disable scale snapping. Again, R to go into scale mode, W to go into translation mode. Let's move it in the middle here. Let's scale it on the sides as well. This works a bit better. And now that we have our one window frame, we can copy it to the other windows. For that, let's re-enable our snapping. Alt drag new copies of the mesh into the scene. You can do the same for the door frame. In addition, we can add in other props. There aren't that many in the starter pack, but for example, let's add in a table, a chair, and a couch. Again, save every once in a while. Also, let's add in a light source of some sort. But what good is a light source if it actually doesn't emit any light? For that, let's go into the light section of our placement mode and let's add in a point light. Also, let's make it a bit yellowish to make it a bit warmer. Now you can see that the lighting and shadows aren't really working properly. To fix that, you would need to build lighting. We'll get more deeply into Unreal's lighting pipeline in the last practice session, but for now, just click the build button itself. This could take a while depending on the complexity of your levels. And you can see that the lighting has transformed quite significantly. And that's pretty much it.